is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
In 2020, extreme poverty will impact 1 out of every 10 people in the world.
How can we ensure that there is enough water for farm as climate change and population grow?
And as the pandemic spreads, food insecurity could rise.
政府帮老百姓脱贫能扮演什么样的角色？
Poor infrastructure and limited access to clean water.
हमारे जैसे लोगों के लिए आवास को किफायती रखने के लिए क्या किया जा सकता है?
A lack of education and limited technology.
¿Cómo se puede lograr que todo el mundo tenga un acceso a la educación?
And the problem is heightened by climate change and natural disasters.
Why can't the government raise and enforce a decent minimum wage for the workers?
Inequalities like gender discrimination and inadequate access to health care.
¿Cómo pueden buscar trabajo las mujeres si tienen que quedarse en casa cuidando de sus hijos?
What causes poverty around the world?
我们现在已经实现了全面脱贫，那我们下一步应该怎么样做才能巩固这个扶贫成果，让这些脱贫的老百姓不再返贫呢？
Can we find solutions?
Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo. Welcome to CGTN's Global Action Initiative, dedicated to addressing the world's most pressing issues. Our focus this year is global poverty. It's among the most pressing challenges the world faces today. I grew up in apartheid South Africa and have seen firsthand poverty's impact on people. Even now, more than 25 years after the end of apartheid, the country still struggles with inequality. Today, nearly half the adult population continues to live below the poverty line. In such countries as China, Ethiopia, Ghana, India, and Indonesia, more than half lived in extreme poverty a generation ago. But after 2 decades of growth, the share of people in extreme poverty has been cut by more than 50%. According to the World Bank, China lifted almost 850 million people out of poverty. That's nearly the entire population of the United States times 3, with China having met its goal of eradicating extreme poverty ahead of schedule. But a new challenge has emerged: the global pandemic. Before the outbreak of COVID-19, extreme poverty was expected to drop to about 8% this year. But according to the World Bank, with the addition of the pandemic, it's now set to rise for the first time in more than 2 decades. The Global Action Initiative seeks to commit, engage, and empower. Over the course of the next hour, we'll learn about the root causes and devastating impact of poverty. We'll hear from global experts, a Nobel laureate, and those wrestling with its consequences. Then tomorrow, we'll tackle potential solutions from governments, citizens, and other entities. And stay tuned after each hour for the premiere of 2 documentaries offering an in-depth look at poverty alleviation efforts. So let's get started. Here's the head of China Media Group, Shen Haichong.
大家好，欢迎各位参与和收看中国中央广播电视总台制作的全球脱贫行动特别节目。我这里代表中央广播电视总台，对于大家的参与表示欢迎和感谢。2020年充满着特殊的意义，这一年是联合国成立75周年及可持续发展目标行动10年计划的开局之年，也是中国脱贫攻坚的决胜之年。就在上个月，中国的832个贫困县全部实现了脱贫。自2013年以来，中国累计减少贫困人口9300多万，创造了人类减贫史上的奇迹。就在前几天，我到访了中央广播电视总台定点帮扶的喜德县。这个县位于中国西南部的四川省凉山彝族自治州， 它的海拔高度有2000多米，因为交通闭塞、气候高寒等原因，曾经是中国最贫困的县之一。我看到这里的彝族老百姓都搬到了县城周边的新村，住进了新房。他们告诉我，好像是做了一个梦，做了一个从没有想到的一个美好的梦，生活发生了非常大的变化。我从他们的眼神当中，从他们的笑容里，明显地感觉到他们发自内心的喜悦。这几年，中央广播电视总台发挥媒体优势，我们的主持人参与公益带货直播，推广贫困地区，包括喜德县的农副产品，开展扶贫文体公益系列活动。我们同当地的教育机构合作，通过教育扶贫、扶志、培育人才。喜德之行让我深深地体会到，在减贫方面，媒体是可以有更大的作为的。不久前，中国国家主席习近平宣布，中国将举办数字减贫研讨会，利用数字技术助力消除贫困事业。这将是国际减贫事业发展的一个重要里程碑。当前，我们身处信息化时代，更要有互联网思维，去探寻减贫的新思路。作为一名媒体人，我始终认为，相互借鉴世界各国的脱贫实践经验和智慧意义非凡。媒体应该主动承担起纽带与桥梁的作用。中央广播电视总台持续关注中国的脱贫攻坚故事，分享世界各国的脱贫经验。我们愿意与全球媒体同行携手，同包括联合国在内的国际社会一道，搭建起一个务实高效的减贫经验交流平台，共同建设没有贫困、共同发展的人类命运共同体。谢谢大家。
Ending poverty tops the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, an ambitious objective made even more challenging by the global pandemic. Estimates show COVID-19 could push up to 115 million people into extreme poverty this year. Fabrizio Hochschild is a special advisor to UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
This year marks the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. One of the most remarkable achievements of the United Nations in the past 75 years has been its contribution to global poverty eradication. When the UN came into being, more than half of the world's population was living in extreme poverty. In 75 years, we've gone from 1 in 2 people living in extreme poverty to under 1 in 10 in 2019. China accounts for a large part of this global achievement, but it's not yet the time to celebrate. 75 years after the founding of the UN, we are facing one of the greatest global challenges of our time. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to new poverty, the first increase in global poverty in decades. The world's billionaires have grown their already huge fortunes to a record high of $10.2 trillion during the pandemic, an increase of almost 30%. As we build back from COVID, we need to rebuild our economies to tackle extreme poverty and ever-growing inequality. The UN Secretary-General has stressed some key actions required of all countries to reduce inequality and overcome poverty. First, we need to defeat the pandemic itself. Second, we need to address the growing inequality greatly exacerbated by the fallout from COVID-19. Inequality can undermine social cohesion and generate violence and conflict. Third, we need to put greater emphasis on digital transformation and securing universal, affordable digital access for all. In summary, we need to renew our collective commitment to the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals as the blueprint for progress.
The International Monetary Fund is warning that the pandemic could reverse 30 years of progress fighting global poverty. Emerging market countries and developing economies could be hardest hit. Here's the IMF's first Deputy Managing Director, Jeffrey Okamoto.
Let me start by thanking CGTN for the invitation to speak at the Global Action Initiative on Poverty Alleviation. I will start by looking at how COVID-19 has affected the fight against global poverty, discuss priorities for countries, and how the International Monetary Fund can help. Global poverty and inequality are rising again. Since the 1980s, global poverty fell because a strong and durable push of economic liberalization resulted in strong growth in emerging markets, particularly in China. Inequality also fell globally, although it increased within some countries. Growth slowed as reform agendas lost momentum, but now the pandemic is outright reversing these gains. Our research on recent pandemics, SARS, H1N1, and others, found that they raised income inequality and hurt employment prospects of those with lower education. These events also increased social unrest and instability. Now, besides destroying millions of current jobs, the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to leave deep scars in the next generation as well. According to the United Nations, about 1.6 billion students in 190 countries have been affected by school closings this year. Children without access to a computer and internet are falling behind. The loss of educational attainment is one of the most perverse and longer-lasting scars of this crisis. Those who achieved higher education are no better off. Graduating in a recession means fighting for fewer available jobs and lower salaries at the beginning of one's career. Studies have shown that starting from behind can affect a person's entire financial life, meaning lower savings, consumption, and retirement. Now, tackling these problems will be harder because countries are in worse financial health. Countries are doing the right thing now, spending what is needed to support health and social protection. But that spending, combined with the sharp output decline and the collapse of government revenue, will push public debt to record levels. This will significantly limit countries' margin for maneuver, particularly where borrowing costs are already higher, and some countries are unable to borrow from global capital markets at all. Countries are going to have to do more with less fiscal resources, putting increased focus on improving the quality of government spending. In many cases, too, monetary policy is constrained because interest rates are already very low. Once the health emergency is controlled, our focus should turn to advancing reforms that can boost a country's growth potential, generate better jobs, and increase resilience. Since the pandemic's onset, we've provided over $101 billion in total financing to 82 countries. We extended debt service relief to our poorest members, and together with the World Bank, we support the G20's Debt Service Suspension Initiative. This relief is very important because poor countries are least equipped to fight this pandemic battle. We estimated that advanced economies spent more than 10 times that of low-income countries to support their economies as a percentage of GDP. Debt relief frees up resources for health and social spending. China and other countries' commitments to participate in the restructuring of debts that can't be repaid are to be commended for their generosity and for being willing to provide relief. Our capacity development helps countries boost revenue in several ways: designing simpler, fair, and more efficient tax structures, improving revenue collection, controlling spending, fighting evasion and avoidance. This helps countries continue providing health, education, and essential social services, as well as rebuild their finances and address debt problems. Through cooperation, I have confidence that we will recover from this global crisis and resume progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
One of the leading voices in the fight against global poverty is Dr. Muhammad Yunus. In the 1970s, the economist introduced a revolutionary concept: microfinancing. He gave money to those who were too poor to qualify for traditional loans. Microfinancing empowered women and gave marginalized communities the ability to control their destiny. It helped change millions of lives, won Dr. Yunus the Nobel Peace Prize, and earned him the moniker Banker to the Poor. He's our next speaker.
Poverty is not created by poor people. So it's not, we should not be aiming all our programs just to say it as if that's the problem there. I said the problem is somewhere else. Poverty is created by the system that we built, and that causes the poverty. So trying to work with poor people will not solve the problem of poverty. We have to solve the problem of poverty at the root, the very basis on which we work, how the system functions. And we know already the three basic problems that we see right now. One is the global warming, and this is not something coming from somewhere else. It's just the way we behave, just the way we work, that causes the global warming. So it's a creation of the system. And unless we change the system, we cannot change the global warming. Similarly, the cause of, the problem that is caused by the system is a wealth concentration. All the wealth of the world is concentrated in few hands. Almost you can say that 1% of the population controlling the world, 99% of the world's wealth. So very little is left for other people, the 99% of the people. I've been talking about making credit as a human right, accepting credit as a human right, because it's so fundamental. I've been explaining that finance is like economic oxygen. If you don't give that oxygen to people, people cannot function economically. So they cannot do their thing that they're capable of because the finance is not connected with them. That oxygen is not connected with them. I said that the moment you connect people with the oxygen, the financial oxygen, then they become alive and active. They overcome their own problems. People said it cannot be done. You cannot bring financial services to the poor people. We demonstrated that it can be done, and people can interact with the financial system in a very solid way. It's not something that you give the money, they never pay back. The payback has been near 100%. We have no problem with that. Over years, so now 42 years we have been doing. And now the idea of microfinance has spread all over the world. So that experience is everywhere. Simply, financial system doesn't accept that. Financial system still remain the same. So I said, unless the financial institutions are designed to serve everybody, not just the privileged people and at the top, so that you can continue with the process of wealth concentration. Unless you redesign the financial system, there is no way you can stop the wealth concentration and continue to produce the elements in the forces in the economic system where all the wealth flows in one direction, towards the top.
For more on what poverty looks like around the world, check out our website at globalactioninitiative.com or scan the on-screen QR code. You can watch a live stream of the program and find a range of interactive elements, including polling, quizzes, and stories highlighting some of the day-to-day heroes. Of all the ancient scourges afflicting humanity, fire, flood, famine, and pestilence, the one most closely linked to famine, extreme poverty, seemed close to being tamed. It's been declining for the past 25 years.
In many parts of the world.
But UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the global response to achieve poverty and environmental goals hasn't been ambitious enough. Lowering extreme poverty below 3% by 2030 will still be challenging. Nearly a decade of war has driven millions of Syrians into deep poverty, illustrating a point about its root causes. They are interconnected. Here in Nicaragua, there is no armed conflict, but long-term income inequality prevents the country's most vulnerable from escaping poverty. 2020 has been no ordinary year for China and the world. Despite the COVID-19 epidemic and floods in southern China, China met the UN Sustainable Development Target for poverty reduction 10 years ahead of schedule. China alone accounts for 70% of global poverty reduction. Since 2015, it's backed 180 poverty alleviation projects in developing countries. To limit economic aftershocks from locusts, famine, and the pandemic, the World Bank has arranged up to $160 billion in emergency funding for developing nations. As these joint endeavors suggest, progress will require teamwork that spans the globe. As we've seen, there's much to talk about. Let's get to our distinguished panel. Jorge Heiner served as the Chilean ambassador to several countries, including China. He is currently a research professor at Boston University's School of Global Studies. South Africa's former ambassador to the United States, Ibrahim Rasool, is with us from Cape Town. He's the founder of the World for All Foundation, focusing on such issues as human development, coexistence, and social justice. Author, philanthropist, and scientist William Haseltine joins us from Roxbury, Connecticut. Best known for his groundbreaking work on HIV/AIDS, he currently heads Access Health International. And Wang Houyao is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, a think tank based in Beijing. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Wang Houyao, let me start with you. Back in 2013, China set the goal of eradicating poverty by 2020. What was the strategy, and where does the country stand today?
Well, I think China has actually made its established goal actually through all those years' efforts. I think at the 2013 that the government has really made eliminating poverty as the fundamental objective of the for China to achieve the moderate developed society. So I think that this is really crucial. So for the last 4 decades, actually, China is constantly doing that, has been already lifting 800 million people out of poverty. But I think also more than that, China basically already have a 1.3 billion people have some basic medical coverage, and also over 1 million have some medical coverage, but also 1.3 billion for the social coverage. So it's social security coverage for some kind. So I think this is really very achievement of China for the last 4 decades, but particularly for the last 7-8 years that the government has made this a priority for the Chinese development. And this is really, I think 2020 is the time that China actually achieved its target. And then I think they're going to really reach this kind of level of alleviating extreme poverty. So I think that is really a fundamental achievement that China has.
Jorge Heiner, ending poverty tops the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Last year, there were about 184 million people in South America were living under the poverty line, 62 million of them in extreme poverty. Do you think that the policies that China has developed could work in other countries?
Well, it seems to me there are several things that are important to underscore. One of them, obviously, the main driver of China's achievement has been Chinese economic growth. If you grow at 10% a year for 30 years in a row, there are bound to be very significant wealth creation, and a lot of people will be lifted from poverty. But I will say this: what I find interesting about the case of China is that in addition to just overall economic growth and job creation, what you have is also quite targeted efforts, identifying the counties that have the highest poverty rates, working very closely with those counties, spending more in infrastructure, spending more in social services and in educational program in those counties as a way of offsetting that poverty situation. In that sense, it seems to me one of the big lessons of the Chinese poverty alleviation program is that you need a combination of both economic growth per se and sort of universal social coverage, but then also very targeted efforts, identifying those counties that are mostly in need, even families, individuals that are mostly in need. And that, it seems to me, is the big takeaway from the Chinese experience.
Ibrahim Rasool, as we've just heard, economic growth is closely tied to alleviating poverty in any country for that matter. South Africa is one of the largest economies in Africa, but we've also seen that the wealth of the country is not equitably divided. It's very, very unequal. It's not a level playing field. South Africa's also suffered from anemic growth. It's in negative territory right now. Half the country continues to live in poverty. Are there any lessons from the Chinese experience for South Africa?
Yeah, no, I think that South Africa's history since apartheid must be divided into two parts, the first 15 years and the last 10 years. And the first 15 years, you would have seen a inherited poverty, inherited inequality, color-coded, because blacks were largely poor, whites were largely white, and concentrated capital in the hands of a white minority. But the state offset the negotiated settlement with particular social interventions, such as a social security network, which covered 16 million people. Every month, we've had 1 million people on expanded public works programs, and at the same time, through largely commodity trade, we have been able to, in that first 15 years, to reach a growth rate in GDP of about 5%. We've been able to save, and that's why we could host the 2010 World Cup. And so, in a sense, our society was not equal, was not free of poverty, but was in some sense of equilibrium. I think we then had a triple whammy, a triple affliction in the last 10 years. I think we became much more of a kleptocratic state, a corrupt elite that took what was meant to benefit the poor. I think secondly, we had recession that then developed as a result of a commodities trade setback. And then I think we had COVID-19. And so the combination of those three in the last 10 years have really eroded much of the gains that South Africa had made up to 15 years ago, when even our Millennium Development Goals were increasingly being achieved. And so I think we've had a mixed history over the last 25 years. The current state is not very good. We need China, for example, as Africa and South Africa to get out of a trade war with the USA, and maybe that can be helped by Biden. And I think secondly, we need to be able to regain our composure as a nation, eliminate corruption, and start the hard work of getting economic growth and social distribution back on track.
William Hazeltine, we've seen what the coronavirus has done to economies around the world over the past year. Global poverty is set to top 1 billion people due to the coronavirus pandemic. Put another way, it will lower the incomes of the world's poorest people by $500 million a day. Another 150 million people could be pushed into poverty next year, mostly in Asia. So lay it out for us. What is the relationship between the pandemic and poverty?
Well, first of all, I would point out that the previous speakers avoided your primary question, except for the Chinese speaker, because they didn't talk about, can Chinese methods help their regions? I think the reason they didn't is because it's very unlikely that what China achieved could be achieved in those regions, and that similar methods could be applied. Same as for the United States. One of the questions that was asked of me in advance is, why is there still poverty in the United States? We have serious poverty. We have to address it. I think it's very unlikely we can address it through the same methods that the Chinese have. That being said, the Chinese have not eliminated poverty in their country by the year 2020. It just simply isn't true. And secondly, there are great health inequities throughout the Chinese system, especially for those who work in the countryside and come into the city. The hospital systems, the whole health system needs serious reform still. So things aren't 100% the way they should be or would like to be in China. But that being said, they're well on the road. They are the one country that will not experience, or the one major country that will not experience the slip into poverty of the poorest of their population because of COVID. The reason is they've basically eliminated COVID from their country by very rigorous public health means. And I think it's a great tragedy that the rest of the world hasn't followed what China has done for COVID. If they had, we in the United States, Europe, all of South America, India, would not be in the dreadful situation we are now, where not only a lot of people are getting infected, a lot of people are dying, and many millions of more are suffering economic distress and slipping from the tenuous hold they had on the lower rungs of the economic ladder back into poverty. It is a big tragedy. Could have been avoided by very systematic application of the public health measures that China implemented.
Okay, stay with us. We'll get back to our panel in a moment. Hailed as the largest such campaign, China's anti-poverty initiative has been doing quite well. In 2012, the number of impoverished people in rural areas was almost 99 million. By the end of last year, that number fell to just 5.5 million. Government money and policies have made a difference, but Beijing has also sent experts to the most impoverished counties and villages to turn policies into action. Here's the story of one poverty relief official, Fei Cheng.
Fei Cheng works on the front lines of poverty alleviation in Shuangzhen village.
像我们整个村子是因为比较偏远嘛，没有并入到那个整个市政的管网里头，外面的自来水是不通的嘛。
The on-the-ground anti-poverty work by workers like Fei Cheng means checking on the welfare of every single family in the village.
那我进来看一下吧。哪里在漏啊？
那你下大雨哎，现在。
你是说从这里打雨水打雨进来是吧？
那是下来。
那你这里要装窗户吧？我帮你叫人来装个窗户，好吧？ 我们整个村委会一共只有10户贫困户，每一户都有码，我们叫一户一码，就是我们每一户贫困户它都有一个这个二维码，这每一样的扶贫信息网上都可以查到。
Today, Fei Cheng meets with beekeeper Gong Haijing.
我们就打听到，在我们旁边的，就是我们因为是和福建交界嘛，旁边的武夷山那边。 有一个养蜂大户，他养的蜂比较好，我们就看和他是不是能有个合作，就是因为他会养，有技术，我们有信用，能卖出去，有渠道，我们是不是可以互相合作一下？就和他去商量。基本上是一个双赢。
All right, let's get back to our panel. Wang Houyao, as we saw, it is part of China's strategy to lift people out of poverty by deploying officials into impoverished areas. But their mission, like we heard from Fei Cheng, is not without challenges. When we spoke to him, he expressed his concerns and posed this question.
There are many more poverty alleviation special officials in China just like me. We're committed to helping poor people get rid of poverty. But how do we keep them out of poverty? Are there any successful examples that we can learn from?
So that's a big challenge, isn't that, Wang Houyao? How do we keep people out of poverty?
Well, I think we have to develop a consistent mechanism really to help them. I mean, we need to have the tool in place. For example, I mean, a lot of poverty was caused by there's no electricity, no internet, no access to the infrastructure, the roads, bridges. I think China's done that very well, in the last 4 decades, particularly in the last 10, 20 years. China basically, as I said, industrialized country, infrastructure-wise, has really got China already well in place. But on top of that, China also trained a lot of talent. They have actually sent college graduates to the rural area as village officials. But also I think that the digital economy has really connected many rural areas that they can sell the product that the youth cannot sell, and then they can really get access to the big market and to the urban centers. So variety of ways, I think that coupled with technology, coupled with talent, coupled with instant streaming of their product into the pipeline of the cities, and coupled with the also the massive access facility that's convenient. And I think on top of that, the government has really put this as a measurement for all the officials at all ranks, that you have to do it, you really have to do it. So the whole societal approach, I think, charities, business, companies, everything. So I think that has built this comprehensive approach that has really made China achieve this kind of objective. So in order to sustain that, I think that we have to really keep this kind of a system in place, and also this kind of rule, and also this kind of model in place to really to keep it forward.
William Hazeltine, when we look at the strategy that China has adopted, sending officials, whether it be bureaucrats or medical personnel, into poor areas, especially in the rural parts of the country, can that strategy work in other parts of the world?
It certainly can work in other parts of the world, and people have tried it, some with varied success. I think if we look at what lifts people from poverty, it is, as the previous speaker said, economic growth, and that is macroeconomic policy. If you look around the world, it isn't the question you asked earlier of one country helping another. It's each country helping themselves. If you don't have good macroeconomic policies, nobody from outside can help you. The same is not exactly true internally. You have to really focus, as China has done, on some of the minorities. Now, China, like other countries, has minority issues that are still unresolved. And like we do in America, those are things we have to continually work on day in and day out. And there are divided opinions within most countries about how to handle minority issues. But I think at this point, for a country like China, a country like the United States, with well-developed economies, there's also the problem of income distribution. Every country that gets rich, whether it be China or the United States or Europe, has issues of income distribution. You heard that from South Africa. We've got to make sure that the power of the wealthy, whether it's in one system or another, doesn't distort and detract from the benefit of all.
Jorge Heiner, given that poverty levels are rising for the first time in 20 years, does the effort to eradicate poverty need some kind of a course correction, perhaps a new strategy?
Well, you're absolutely right. In the case of Latin America, because of COVID, projections are that poverty levels will be back to what they were in 2006. So we're back 15 years, essentially, from all the progress that we have made in the course of the past 2 years. That, of course, is a very tragic situation that needs addressing. Now, on that, I would like to elaborate a bit on the question of extreme poverty in what some people refer to as hardcore poverty. You have, once you reach a certain level in which you reduce poverty, you will reach a moment in which you find certain groups in which poverty has been endemic for sometimes generations. And there, it's not just the hard questions, electricity, infrastructure, access to education, but there are certain sort of life habits, being able to get to a job on time, having the discipline that it takes to keep a job. Those things, when they have been not in families, not sometimes for generations, that becomes a really tough issue. So in our experience in Chile, that is a real challenge. The first phase, what you might call, of poverty reduction is not as complex. But once you reach that situation of extreme poverty, people that are really in dire straits and have been in dire straits for decades and sometimes for generations, as I said earlier, they have been in families that have been afflicted by poverty, then it becomes a real question that needs intervention by social workers, educators, psychologists, for them to be able to lift them by their own bootstraps with state assistance. But they need to learn what it takes to hold the job, to keep a job, and make progress. That is a real challenge.
Wang Huiyao, what were some of the root causes of poverty in China? And are they pretty much the same in other places? Take India, for example. Would we find the same reasons for poverty there as well?
Well, not necessarily. I think each country probably has its specific conditions and the situation. You know, like I know in China, in the past, there's quite a lot of remote counties, villages, and far from urban centers, no transportation, no electricity, no internet, and then you know very harsh conditions, natural weather and things like that. So it's really I think there's a lot of difficulties China has. China has a vast territory, and then you have a lot of mountains, you have remote areas, and then there's no education. I think one of the things that does really working is the education. China has implemented a compulsory education from 1 to 9 across the country now. So all the kids now goes to school. That's remarkable. And also, as I said, they achieved you know basic Medicare for 1 billion people, and then Social Security for 1.3 billion people. So it's really remarkable. Over 1 billion people actually enjoying some kind of Medicare and also Social Security.
William Hazeltine, your foundation is devoted to improving access to quality health care. The poorest are the most vulnerable. What do you see as some of the root causes of poverty?
Well, I think that we've touched on many of them. But I think what we have to look at as we look forward is a realization that major shocks like COVID are going to happen. There will be health shocks, so you have to have a health system which is prepared. And surprisingly, people who thought that the social welfare systems of Europe would buffer the shock of COVID has not done it. They have suffered horribly, and especially in the second wave. United States has certainly suffered from inadequacies of a centralized healthcare program without central authority. We've had terrible problems. But I think there's other shocks that we have to be prepared for. We've mentioned climate change, but climate change is probably going to be a bigger stress on bringing the world's population from poverty into the economies, into middle class, than even these healthcare shocks. These healthcare shocks we will get over. But climate change, the way it's heading now, we're not going to get over. We're going to be changing the macro environments that lead to mass starvation. We're going to be flooding our coastal areas. We're going to be changing the disease profiles in many countries where tropical disease are moving into temperate climates. And I don't see the world. This is something that where you really do have to cooperate on a world basis, both for health and for climate. And I think those are the biggest threats. Climate change is going to affect everybody, China included. And we need to make really good progress on that as well. And I think that is the area, both international health and climate change, where we need global cooperation to help buffer the world from these tragic consequences that are major setbacks for hundreds of millions of people.
Ibrahim Rasool, South Africa emerged from the apartheid system in the 1990s after a long and bitter struggle, and you know a lot about that. You were part of that struggle. But to what extent does the legacy of apartheid still impact inequality and poverty in South Africa?
I think that legacy is going to be with us for a while, and it's going to be dangerous in the sense that it is color-coded. I think that when you see white opulence and extreme black poverty, you have a recipe for social instability and social incoherence. And so already South Africa is becoming a bit of a fertile ground for populist politics. But what's keeping us away from out and out civil conflict is the fact that the state has continued to buffer the very poor against real hunger and all of those kind of things. And so we are having those legacies of education deficits, health deficits that are there, spatial inequality when people are condemned to poverty zones, and those poverty zones are then exacerbated by climate change, the absence of resources like water, and conflicts around those kind of things, and the displacement that is neither planned nor desired, I think all of those kind of things are going to be exacerbated. In a sense, what COVID-19 has done was not to bring more poverty, but to expose and exacerbate the existing fault lines in our society, and so it has shown up exactly what the legacy of this apartheid is and how fast we have to move to deal with it. And so I think that the state is going to be under enormous pressure to push through land reform, to make sure that, to use a South African parlance, that there's radical economic transformation. And at the same time, in its haste to deal with it, it must guard against the temptation of corruption. We saw that when there was the emergency spending on COVID-19, there were some, again, who fed at the trough to corrupt the process. So I think we're dealing with both objective and subjective factors, but it's undeniable that we are dealing with a legacy of apartheid, but we need to be able to deal with it in a way that doesn't make it a cliche of the past, but a real way in which to solve a problem.
Coming up at the top of the hour, the premiere of the CGTN documentary Rise Up, Poverty Alleviation in China. Here's a sneak peek.
China's massive anti-poverty campaign faces its biggest challenge yet as COVID-19 takes its toll.
很大有可能就会影响到我们2020年的整个一个脱贫摘帽。
But despite the global pandemic, there is opportunity.
哎呀，在菜市场嘛，碰到那些那个吧，机会好还是好，好卖，满地人还是多。
Driven by much-needed infrastructure.
一直就是觉得骑那个火车比较稀奇，又没坐过，就是呢，他让老百姓就盼望那个火车也想看到火车再有个小火车通了，就看啥子啊。
An embrace of new technologies.
那是周日先四周一下，大扫而走，我叫公建设，目前在这个没有草地，就是而走。
And a dedicated team working on the ground.
他有什么问题的话，我们不管是上级来检查也好，还是其他的部门单位来好，都可以查到他到底是什么原因，就更有针对性的帮助他。
Rise Up, Poverty Alleviation in China.
According to the World Bank, only about 35% of the population in developing countries have access to the internet. From information to jobs, it can be an important avenue toward poverty reduction and shared prosperity. Douglas Shitote is helping to connect the people in Kenya.
Yeah, morning. My name is Douglas Shitote, and currently we are at the headquarters of BRIC Kenya. I'm the senior field engineer. I take care of the deployments, mostly the field processes. I take care of that. Yeah, I think everything is okay here. So I'll grab this. Currently, we are doing a deployment in the low-income areas. One of the areas is called Kibera. We've been able to reach a lot of areas that many of the other big companies would not desire to reach. If you realize we have thousands, if not millions of people every day acquiring smartphones, but the issue now becomes that the cost of bundles or internet connectivity is always a big challenge. So BRIC has always taken the challenge of trying to see how can we connect as many people as we can to the internet in an efficient way and in a way that also impacts those people, but at a lower cost. The most exciting part of connecting people to the internet is being able to see that people who could not afford expensive internet is that now they're happy that they've found a cheaper option to connect, and also being able to reach out to them and talking to them and understanding some of the challenges that they are facing, and being able to keep working through improving some of the expectations of clients.
Okay, let's rejoin our panel. Wang Hoyao, as we saw, connecting people is important to lifting folks out of poverty. We have a question here from someone impacted by poverty.
How can we make our roads and sewer systems better, even as we're now getting free internet?
It's a good question there. Roads, sewers, and the internet, of course, are all important, but how do governments do that?
Well, I think that's probably where the Chinese system comes in, that proves to be effective. I think sometimes in a totally market-oriented society, the government probably also every 4 or 5 years of a changing of the government, it may not have that kind of attention span that lasting very long for meeting those challenges. I think in China, you see that is what the government is doing, and so the government has to really put forward, like infrastructure, it's very costly, and many countries probably cannot do that, but China, once the government has got resources, have tax revenues, and then they're actually spending on those infrastructures to help, better sewage, better pipelines, better electricity and internet. So that, I think, paved a very good foundation for China to eliminate poverty, because all the people now have the infrastructure. Anywhere you go in China these days, 4 or 5 hours by speed train, and also internet. You got 1 billion smartphone users now in China. That's incredible. Everybody can live stream their products, no matter how remote you are. And then you got Alibaba and JD, to deliver the goods anywhere you want to go. So I think that kind of system, that kind of a systematic approach by the private sector, market forces, government, and international multinationals together, that I think that made China unique. But of course, on top of that, I think the government has to invest, and the government has to really take public goods, provide public availability first, rather than really think about making money on that. So that's, I think, the beauty of Chinese government, and also a lot of SOE basically making no money to do that at the government instructions. So I think this kind of a model is really probably quite unique, but it's proved to be effective, and then that's where China achieved what has been done today.
Jorge Heine, what in your view is the role that technology can play in this battle against poverty?
Well, an important part of the reason why a lot of people are still in poverty is because they haven't had the access to education, haven't had the access to the skills that they need to have marketable skills to offer in today's economy. Technology, in that sense, can play a critical and absolutely vital role. And I would also like to draw on a bit on what the previous speaker said in terms of connectivity. The way to generate initiative, the way to generate economic activity in today's world is via connectivity. Both physical infrastructure and digital infrastructure is absolutely critical. In that sense, it seems to me a big takeaway from the Chinese experience is that if you are able to unify your territory, as it were, as China has done with two things over the past 15 years, with the bullet trains and physical connectivity, and two, with mobile telephony, bringing the country together, something that was a long-standing aim in China and had never really been achieved. It seems to me there's an important lesson there for other countries around the world. If you are able to unify your territory and generate connectivity for most of the population, well, then you are in a different position than if you don't have that.
William Haseltine, we talked earlier about poverty in the United States. What efforts are there being made in the United States to eradicate poverty? I mean, we do know in the United States that there's widening inequality in the country. There's income inequality, there's wealth inequality. What's being done?
Well, let me first of all say that infrastructure and connectivity are not the total solution to the problem. Here in the U.S., we have reasonable infrastructure. It's not as modern as that of China, but it's pretty robust. We have great connectivity. Many services are connecting us. We have the ability to be educated for free through the internet, and it's not enough. You have to focus on the social problems that underlie poverty in a place like the United States, and it will be in many other countries. I would say whatever we have in the U.S. is exacerbated by social attitudes, by social structures in places like India and places like South America. And possibly, I don't know about Africa, but I suspect in Africa as well. There are very deep social issues. Another very deep issue that has been addressed effectively in China is education. While we have some of the world's best educational institutions in the United States, a great portion of our population is deeply undereducated. In many of our urban centers, less than half of people graduate from high school. Many people are not really functionally literate. That is a tremendous failing. And it's a failing of an overemphasis, in my view, of individuality and free market access. We have major fights, and I think it's going to happen throughout the world. It will even happen to some extent, I think, in China, about how you distribute the new wealth that's created. So there's a whole series of issues which more have to do with political structure and social structure than they do actually with infrastructure. I think the one thing that we've learned from China and from COVID is that the power of the central government is really important. Provincial governments don't have resources that are needed to address these fundamental problems of education, infrastructure, and when it comes to a health crisis, health. You need a powerful central government to make sure that every resource available, including debt resources, are available to help address these problems. And I think those are lessons, as some of our previous speakers said, that COVID, I hope, will be a wake-up call, not just for America, but for many other countries, that we have to do things differently from what we've done before.
Ibrahim Rasool, what do you see as the major obstacles to success, and how quickly can those obstacles be overcome?
Look, I think that we need, I would agree, strong central governments that are not afraid to use its power, but is also curtailed from misusing its power for wrong purposes such as corruption. I also think, secondly, that we need global governance as opposed to simply international governance. We cannot simply stand in an age of pandemics on the sovereignty of the state. We've got to have collaborative and cooperative governance at the global level. I also think we need good multilateralism. South Africa's future is not separate from Africa's future, and Africa's future is to be negotiated with trade and other roles with China, with Europe, with the United States, with South America, and all of those kind of things. I also think that we need both kinds of infrastructures, electronic and concrete, and I think they can be drivers of economic participation, of growth, and all of those kind of things, but the underlying social inequalities cannot be carried forward into the future. Women cannot be left out of the conversation. Youth have to be skilled and included, and certainly I think rural areas are going to be very vulnerable. And so in a sense, we are going to need to manage all of those factors at once. And I end where I started. COVID-19 has been a tragedy, but it offers the opportunity of thinking out of the box.
And that's where we have to end it. We're out of time. My thanks to our panel. That's it for our first look at global poverty. Join us tomorrow when we focus on innovative ways to end it. Among our guests, the Deputy Executive Director of the World Food Programme, winner of this year's Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts to combat world hunger. Stay with us. The premiere of the CGTN documentary, Rise Up, Poverty Alleviation in China, begins right now.